Once you've masticated or chewed your food and it's ready to be shuttled to the stomach, you have to get it there via the esophagus. And so we're going to talk briefly about the role the esophagus plays. It doesn't really play a role in chemical digestion. It doesn't play a role in mechanical digestion. Really all it does is it serves as a point of conveyance between the mouth and the stomach. So the esophagus begins right inferior to the larynx. And remember, the larynx is what we commonly call the voice box. Okay, so the esophagus is inferior to the larynx. Above that point, we have the pharynx. The pharynx is sort of the common tube that leads to both the esophagus and to the trachea. And that pharynx is basically back where your throat is, if you want to think of it like that, that common area back there in your throat where air goes down and food goes down and then either splits off to go to the lungs via the trachea or to the stomach via the esophagus. So when food enters into the pharynx, there are some smooth muscle rings called the pharyngeal constrictors. And these smooth muscle ring constrictors contract, and they help to push the food downward till it gets to the point of the esophagus. And don't forget that we have this flappy structure in place called the glottis, made of elastic cartilage that covers over the trachea when we're swallowing so that those pharyngeal constrictors can push the food down into the esophagus and not down into your lungs where you don't want it. So once we have the food, that bolus of food in the esophagus, then we start to have one of those short reflex arcs comes into play. And here's how it works. Here's in yellow is my food bolus here, and the esophagus is in pink. As the esophagus gets stretched because of the presence of that food bolus, there is a response of the smooth muscle tissue in that area. When they are stretched, their response is to contract. Now remember, there's those two layers. There's the inner circular layer of smooth muscle tissue, and there's an outer longitudinal layer. The inner smooth muscle layer tends to contract at the point behind the bolus, and it tends to relax more at the point in front of the bolus. And that's going to help to, just like when you squeeze on the end of a tube of toothpaste to squeeze the toothpaste out, it helps to shuttle that bolus forward, if you will, or downward towards the stomach, if you want to think of it that way. So that's what the circular layer is doing. The circular layer constricts behind the bolus and it relaxes in front of the bolus, and the combined effect is that moves the bolus downward towards the stomach. Meanwhile, and it's not shown in this picture, but meanwhile the longitudinal layer tends to shorten up. Okay, it gets shorter in the region where the food bolus is and behind the point of the food bolus. And what this does is it's shortening everything behind the point of the food bolus longitudinally, and that helps to also shuttle the bolus forward. And so the bolus moves forward by this series of orchestrated relaxation and contraction, and that contraction relaxation process is called peristalsis. We're going to see peristalsis again in a couple of other places in the digestive tract. So when you get this bolus moving down the esophagus, eventually it reaches the intersection between the esophagus and the stomach right here. So the stomach would be down here. At this location there is a circular ring of smooth muscle tissue called a sphincter, and it's called the cardiac sphincter because it's located right in the cardiac region of the stomach, and I'll show you where the cardiac region of the stomach is located on the next part of the lecture. So this is the main way by which we move food from the pharynx to the esophagus and eventually to the stomach. Here's a nice X-ray here showing you how, just like I said, behind the point of the food bolus, we have that circular layer really contract to kind of pinch the food bolus forward. And notice how it swells outward. It kind of relaxes in the location of the food bolus to help shuttle it forward. And here would be the stomach down here where that bolus is about to enter. The process of swallowing is an interesting one. We're not going to look at it in too much detail, but it's also called the process of deglutition. So deglutition means to swallow. It's in part coordinated by the pons and the medulla oblongata, which have nuclei or bundles of neuronal soma that are responsible for initiating and orchestrating this process of swallowing. And there are multiple stages to this. Obviously, there's a voluntary phase when you decide, oh, I want to swallow my food now. And that's when your tongue sort of forces that food bolus back into your pharynx back here. And at that point, that's called the buccal phase or the voluntary phase here. Same thing, buccal phase, voluntary phase. Then once I've decided I'm going to swallow and that food bolus has gotten pushed back into where it's starting to enter into my pharynx, then I enter into this second phase here, the pharyngeal phase or the pharyngeal esophageal phase. Okay, I guess this picture splits it out as two distinct events. So first, there's the pharyngeal part of the phase, which is where obviously the food bolus is located in the pharynx. And at this point, there are touch receptors that are found in the pharynx that are sensitive to the pressure of that food bolus entering. And when that occurs, those touch receptors initiate this series of events, and a couple of different things happen. One thing that happens is the uvula, that's the hanging down thing in the back of your throat, sort of swings upward along with your soft palate, and together they kind of close off your sinuses so that you don't accidentally force food up into your paranasal sinuses. And we also get the the epiglottis here, that little flap tissue, gets forced down over top of the trachea here. And that's so that this food bolus doesn't go down into your lungs. Okay, so you've got your uvula and the soft palate close off the nose. The epiglottis closes off the glottis, or the opening to the trachea. And what's left is the only place that the food bolus can go then is down the esophagus instead. So that's the pharyngeal phase. Once I actually get into the esophagus, now I'm in the esophageal portion of the phase, and then this is where that peristalsis we talked about takes over. We get constriction behind the food bolus, relaxation in front of it, moves the bolus forward until we reach the point of it entering into the stomach. So again, just to show you this peristaltic event, here's another nice picture of it. Again, this is a short reflex arc, which means just local stimulus is enough to induce contraction of smooth muscle tissue. We don't even have to consult with the brain on this. It happens without that consultation. And it involves that constriction behind the food bolus and relaxation in front of the food bolus, and the combined effect is that the food bolus moves forward. And again, remember, while the circular muscles are doing this constriction and relaxation, the longitudinal muscles are all contracting, and that just, I guess I could show it this way, they're contracting inward, and that helps to shorten up the total length of the esophagus and get the food bolus to the stomach more readily.